Hey Reddit, what's the strangest coincidence you've ever personally experienced? Started dating this girl a few weeks ago. We get to talking about where we live etc. She lives in not only the same building but exact same apartment I lived in 2 years ago. It was so ducking bizarre walking into my old apartment that I never thought I would see again. What are the odds? My sister, Emily, was on a ski lift in New Mexico when some younger girl across from her asked if her name was Emily. Apparently the stranger, who kind of looked similar but underage, had found her lost ID the year prior and had been using it for a year to buy alcohol. Edit. After this blew up I texted my sister who reminds me it was weirder. She was later hiking with friends for 17 hours. They got tired, thumbed for a hitchhike and got picked up by this girl's twin. I used to get 2 buses home from work. I got off the first one having left my phone and keys on the front seat of the bus without realizing. Got on the second bus, went to my favored front seat and my possessions that I didn't know were missing were waiting for me. The bus had changed driver and route. Still freaks my nut out to this day. When I was 18, I lived in a town a very long ways away from where I ended up moving. I struck up a friendship with this guy from work in that town. We play Halo, watch movies, act, and he was awesome. I ended up moving suddenly due to a family emergency and never got his contact information. I didn't even remember his name a decade later, but I thought of him often as he was an awesome guy through all the years. 11 years later, I'm working at my job, carpooling with someone from my training class. And one night he asks if I mind his roommate being in the car as he was going to take the car after we got off at work and use it for the night. He introduces us. I turn around, and in the back seat is the guy from the town a very long ways away. We reconnected immediately, and now live together. He's my best friend, for sure. The godfather to my children. In freshman physics, I became friends with the Japanese kid next to me. After a while he was helping me with my Japanese homework, did really well after that. BTW. But after that class, we kinda drifted apart. Fast forward 2 years where I'm an exchange student in Japan over the summer and doing some sightseeing in Kyoto after the program. I'm crossing the street in Kyoto and I hear my name being called out. I look around and there he is. Thousands of miles apart we meet again. We got some drinks and good food together. It was a blast. No, his hometown was not Kyoto. He was also doing sightseeing while home for the summer. Edit. My first gold. Thank you kind internet stranger. I met a Canadian guy while on holiday in South America and we ended up going sightseeing together. At the end of the day a person behind us tapped him on the shoulder and asked if the scar behind his ear was from cancer surgery. They got talking. Turns out they were from the same small town in Canada, had the same type of brain cancer and had been operated on by the same surgeon. When I was a kid, around 13, I played a lot of a video game called Diablo 2. I started a clan with a few people I'd met on the internet and we played every day. At some point we were helping some random person and he asked to join. We thought he was nice enough so we let him in. As part of this clan we had a shared account we used to store game items for each other. After about a month of playing this new guy goes in and changes the password, steals the account and defriends everyone. Completely disappears off the map with all of our stuff. Fast forward a year later and my family moves to Texas and it's my first day at school. I'm sitting in algebra class talking to the person in the seat next to me and he mentions he plays Diablo. I said me too and that I ran a clan and everything. I asked his username and it was him. 2,000 miles away from where I first virtually met this guy. He's sitting next to me in math class. When I told him mine his face went into total shock and he didn't know how to respond. It was awkward for sure. Ended up telling him I didn't care and was over it but let's just say we didn't end up becoming friends. Went to college. Met a cute girl. Cute. Where do you go to high school? She asks. You've never heard of it? I reply. I grew up in a town of 1,200 people. Graduated in a class of about 90. Cute. Try me, she says. And that was the beginning of finding out that not only had she heard of it, she had almost attended it because her family had lived in one of the neighboring towns very briefly when she was growing up. We shared dozens of mutual friends. and had apparently spent our young lives narrowly missing each other. Later, after we started dating, we learned that one of our mutual friends had been trying to set us up with each other for years. She was overwhelmed with laughter when she saw that we were finally together, completely without her involvement. I asked her to marry me. She said yes. We went out to dinner with our parents so they could finally meet. Her folks arrive at the restaurant and see mine. Her mom goes, "Oh hey, my dad's name. So this is your son." Huh. They had been co-workers years ago. Of course. We've been married for 11 years now. Got a good thing going. We intend to keep it. Edit. I'm so glad you all enjoyed this. I love talking about my wife and have tons of wholesome stories like this. We do well because we each feel like we're the lucky one. Enjoy your day. Edit 2. By request of several commenters, I am adding one of my favorite stories of my wife and I in a comment below. It is a much cuter story. Please enjoy. When I was a kid while hiking with my dad, I was babbling and said, "The teacher told us if you speak too much a fly will get in your mouth." In the exact moment a fly flew into my mouth. The person who sits next to me at work copies everything I do except she has no way of knowing. I wear a blue sweater. She wears a blue sweater. I bring leftover spaghetti. She brings leftover spaghetti. It is so weird I almost hate her. Told this story elsewhere but I'm making you all read it again. Was at a convention. There were only a few people in the room. My friend and I wanted an autograph from a voice actor. He started singing in his character voice. There were two random guys next to me. One pulled out a video camera to record it. Years later, my husband and I are talking with friends, and the convention comes up. The guy with the video camera was my husband. I also took a picture later that day of the crowds, and he is in that picture. I stood next to my husband years before I met him. Edit. Thank you to everyone who shared their stories. Amazing how our lives can intersect. And a big thank you to the Redditor who gifted silver. It's a major award. I've mentioned this before on Reddit so I'll just copy paste. But definitely the Shadow D incident. One night in university I was fooling around with my then GF and noticed that the brightness of the TV caused us to cast distinct shadows on the wall behind us. Being 19 and a fool, I took this opportunity to take a pic, using Snapchat, of the shadow my erect D made on the wall and sent the pic to my best friend. I thought it would elicit an interesting reaction but could not have prepared for what was next. You see, on Snapchat you can see when someone receives your message as well as when it's opened. So as my message is sending, still unopened by him, I receive a Snapchat from my best friend. I open it and lo and behold what do I see? A Shadow D snap. This man decided at the exact same time that I did to send an identical pic of his D's shadow on the wall. Both of our GFs were confused thinking it was some inside joke, when in reality we had never spoken of or sent Shadow D's ever before. TLDR. Decided to snap a pic of my D's shadow to my best friend at the exact same time he decided to do the same. Edit. It's cool guys. We said no homo. Was sitting in a restaurant about 200 miles from where I live telling my mother, who was visiting from a different country, about a trip I had to another country, about 6,000 miles away, with a work colleague. And the lady at the table next to us leans over and says, "I think you're talking about my son." Turns out I was sitting next to my colleague's parents while showing my mum pictures of our trip. In grade 10 English class, the teacher didn't have anything planned for us to do and it was close to the end of the year I guess. So she goes to the big Cupo board in the corner and pulls out a stack of copies. It's examples of a successful essay written during a final exam. So we can learn what a good one looks like and how to build a narrative, etc. The topic of these was what was the most pivotal moment of your life? There's 3 examples, ranging in proficiency. We read through the first 2. And I volunteer to read the last one aloud. I start reading. And I stop. The essay was about me. My big sister had gotten a really good mark 6 years earlier on her final exam essay which she wrote about the day I was born. I got pretty emotional about that one. I don't know if this counts as a coincidence, because it might be influenced by the commonalities between us, but I was reading through one of my dad's old journals and found out that he and I share the same Reoccurring nightmare. The details are basically identical, even down to the frequency of it happening, once a month. It's very trippy. Edit. Just to answer some facts. As far as I can remember, I never discussed this with my dad. I felt okay perusing his journal because he's been dead for quite a while now, before his time, but having nothing in common with the details of the dream. It was suicide. I guess you can make of that what you will. I've detailed the dream itself below. When I was 1 year old, we moved to a city some 500 kilometers away from where I was born. 15 years later, my father decided to put me in a boarding school in the area of that first city, because he went there too. I got randomly put in a room with 2 other guys, which one of them is still my best friend Toady. When I first visited that friend at his home, I discovered that he not only lives in the same city as we did, not much of a coincidence, as it's the only major city in that area, but in the same duck-eyeing house. OFC, I couldn't remember our old house, so I called my father to confirm that it's the same address, and it turns out that he very briefly knew my friend's family from selling the house. Edit. I hate you, and Toady said I'm totally right with that. Seeing Paul McCartney, the Beatles, on TV in 2001, and noticing he was tall. Next day I'm walking down a very quiet street, and walking towards me is a really tall guy, and it was Paul McCartney. He must have seen my expression, so he veered my way, stuck his hand out and said, "Hi mate." I was shocked. 18 years later I'm still shocked, lol. Edit. I'm 6 feet 1. Turns out he's 5 feet 11. Maybe he was just lanky. He certainly appeared tall to me. I should also add that he didn't just stick his hand out. I meant to say he shook my hand. Crazy. He then briskly walked away. A very brief encounter, but a really important one for me. I also wouldn't blame anyone for not believing me. It's a weird story. I have an uncommon last name and a not too common first name. I was in the hospital for a surgery and the person in the next room was there for the same surgery. Come to find out that we were second cousins and never knew that the other existed. He had the same name as me and his wife had the same name as my wife. Nobody believes me when I tell this story, but one day my husband and I ran into the same couple at 3 different places, in 2 different states. So my husband and I had an errand to run out of state. We leave early and stop to get breakfast. The couple was sitting across from us. The lady had on a funky shirt, which is why she stuck out in my mind. After breakfast we drive the next state over to the office we have an appointment at. We're waiting in the lobby and the couple from the breakfast joint walks in. Weird, so we spend the day finishing up our errands and then we drive back home. I didn't feel like cooking, so we stopped to get some dinner at the pub. We sit down at a table and guess who's already eating at the table behind us? The same friggin' couple. I wanted my husband to accompany me down to the parking garage in our building to grab something from our car. He was already in his PJ pants and didn't want to come. I convinced him no one would see us, and he reluctantly agreed. We got on the elevator and rode down 1 floor before it stopped to let someone on. The largest, buffest man steps into the elevator wearing his own PJ pants. He said nothing, but gave my husband the dude head nod before getting off on the main floor and disappearing forever. We've never seen him since. 1 year I got a roommate through Craigslist. The guy was weird for sure, but good natured and paid rent. Anyway, after about 2 months of living with him, my cousin comes over to hang. I introduce the two and my cousin in the most chill voice ever said, "Nah man, we know each other." Turns out they were college roommates 5 years earlier in another state. Worked half day, drove 6 hours from Southern California to Northern California for car camping with my wife. Chose obscure campground which was neatly deserted, off season. Picked the most deserted and remote campsite location. We planned on rocking the tent. Were bummed after setting camp and another couple selects site right next to us. Turns out to be a co-worker I'd spoken with earlier that day. Edit. I hadn't told co-worker anything about plans. We weren't close. Earlier that day we spoke briefly of work-related issue. I was in St. Augustine on vacation. On the way there I just happened to think about this girl I knew back in college in Orlando. Just sorta wondered what she was up to and the like. Sure as it I ran into her in a bar there the first night. She was there celebrating graduating from PA school. Was at the dentist getting a crown extension. Dentist: hey, you were born on the 13th of July. So was I. Assistant: me too. We all shared a look of surprise and longing with each other. Longing to be closer. Then they drilled the absolute duck out of my teeth. Edit: oh god, it's happening again. Had a kidney transplant last year. Nurse makes a comment about it having my name on it. He elaborated to say that the donor has the same surname as me. Both of my grandfathers were named William and both grandmothers were named Joyce. My best friend in high school had the same exact locker combination as me in a school of 1,200 people. Saw a combo written on a piece of paper of his and I asked why he wrote down my combo. He looked confused and said that's his combo. The combination locks are changed and reassigned each year. Edit: miss you buddy. Back in the early mid-90s the phone system changed and you no longer needed to dial the area code for a long distance in-state call. We're a small state with only one area code. One morning I woke up to the phone ringing and when I picked up I recognized the voice on the other end as belonging to my old boss from a few years ago. She had an unmistakable voice. We had a nice conversation for a bit before she realized she had dialed the wrong number. I lived in a different town in a different part of the state. But the number must have been off by only one digit from the one she'd tried to call. To add to the coincidence, I had overslept and would have been late for work if she hadn't called me and woken me up. I've had several small world experiences but the biggest was talking to a girl after my first university class and discovering through the course of a 2-hour-long conversation that our grandmothers had been each other's maid of honor and my aunt and her mom were best friends since childhood. Last summer, I went to New York with my family for a week. A friend of mine that I hadn't seen since she graduated from college was living and working in New York at the time. So we decided to meet up for drinks. As we were walking through Times Square at 11 p.m. on a Saturday, who did we see on the other side of the street but another friend of ours from college. I knew he had been living in New Jersey, but he was in New York for a Grindr date. The three of us went to a bar and talked about life and how none of our friends live in Ireland anymore. They've all moved abroad. It was bittersweet and a crazy coincidence that three friends from a small university in Dublin would serendipitously meet in New York City. When I was 18 I dated a girl who went to a private school. She told me they were having a dance so I thought okay great. It'll be a nice night. She told me that only boys from a specific boys' private school were allowed to come because of an incident once when they let everyone in. Some girl got really drunk and puked on the headmaster's shoes so they limited it to one boys' school after that. Fast forward 12 years and I'm with my fiance, different girl, at a wedding shower. I overhear my wife I was so embarrassed when I puked on the headmaster's shoes. I yelled that was you. That's awesome. I love you even more now that you're famous. TLDR. My wife cock-blocked me 12 years before we met. Not me, but a pretty interesting story in my family. Two of my great-grandfathers got imprisoned in the same jail and served time together. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was an architect and even drew my other great-grandfather's house. An officer from a different PD was showing me a picture of a guy they wanted to arrest in a different part of town. As I looked up from the computer, I see Dippet riding by on a bike, literally 5 feet away from the squad car. My favorites occurred during separate canoe trips. The first was during a Labor Day weekend trip up and down the street, Croix River, 2 days paddling upstream, one down, which runs between Wisconsin and Minnesota and eventually joins the Mississippi River. Despite it being a holiday weekend there was virtually no traffic on the river, as we saw only one other boat and that was on the first day shortly after we left. On the second day out, the weather was quite warm. At one point I said, "Boy, a watermelon sure would be good right about now." My 3 companions told me to shut up and not even mention it, because we didn't have one and weren't going to find one in the wilderness. A little while later we spotted a green object floating toward us that turned out to be a watermelon. Years later I was on a river outing with several other people on the Whitewater River in Indiana. I was paddling my kayak and had just told the watermelon story to the people in the canoe next to me. It was a hot summer day, and someone said something to the effect of watermelons are fine, but I could really go for a cold beer right now. A few minutes later we paddled around a bend and saw a cooler sitting on a sandbar. We stopped on the sandbar, opened the cooler, and found that it contained just enough cold beers for each of us to have one. Appalachian trail hikers refer to occurrences like this as trail magic. I guess it happens on rivers too. I moved from my small hometown, halfway across the country to a small city where I knew absolutely no one. At the first party I went to in the new town, I started chatting with a guy. Turns out he had also just left my small hometown. My wife and I were in Tucson visiting my mother who just moved there. My wife decided she wanted tamale. We drove around for 2 hours stopping in restaurants looking for tamales. Couldn't find one. Went back to my mother's apartment. Literally 2 minutes later somebody knocked on the door of my mother's apartment asking us if anyone wanted to buy any tamales. My old work ran a secret Santa once the week before Christmas. It was a $10 limit and the person I was buying for I didn't know very well. I left my buying to the last minute because I just didn't know what to get her. So I was in town and walking past some shops when lo and behold, I see an old copy of Oliver Twist in the window of the second-hand bookstore. It just called to me. So I went in and picked it up. I checked the first page for the cost and guess what? $10 perfect. So come the day of the secret Santa, we were all opening our gifts. Some 150 people. Out of the corner of my eye I see some people crowding around a woman who is crying. I keep listening and people are calling out for the person who is her Santa. I go over and reveal that it was me. The lady I had bought for was crying and hugged me. She said 10 years ago her house burned down along with all her possessions. The book that I bought her was her favorite and also the exact same edition, so had the exact same cover she remembered. Because it was a second-hand book it was even weathered in the same places she remembered. So it was as if I grabbed the book off her shelf before the fire and delivered it to her 10 years later. Me and my partner were looking for a car. We wanted a Subaru Impreza and found one for our price range on our street that had my 3-letter initials for its license plate. The seller was a high school friend of my partner. I had a dream that me and my friend ran into Biggie Smalls. He was alive in the dream world, and he invited us to a party that was on that night. We decided that we were going to buy Biggie a gift and I suggest that we get him a water dragon. A big lizard, because Biggie would look dope rocking a water dragon on his shoulder. We started walking to the party with the lizard and we were at the local park. I looked down next to a bench and there was a snapback bag with white powder. We took the white powder and partied with Biggie that night. The next day I wake up and go to make a coffee. I turn on the radio and Party and Bullet is playing. I thought it was a strange coincidence considering I had a dream about Biggie but thought nothing too much of it. I walked out and froze. On my porch was a water dragon. A water dragon might appear around my house maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I spoke to my mate later that day and told him about the dream and joked that I might find a bag of coke later that day. Sure enough I am walking to my mate's house at night and humor the idea. So I walk over to the bench and found a bag of coke exactly where I dreamt it would be. I definitely disposed of the bag though. Me and my friends definitely hypothetically did not snort the coke while playing Biggie Smalls songs all night and into the morning having the best time of our lives. That would be preposterous. The pastor of church where I was musician informed me that a wedding couple would be coming to see me after Sunday services to discuss music for their forthcoming ceremony. It turned out to be a girl I dated in high school that I hadn't seen or heard from since graduation and her fiance. She remembered my organ playing from back then and already knew what pieces she wanted. I didn't even have to demonstrate. Knew a girl in high school that was just the worst type of person. Take too long to explain all the reasons, but a big one is that she tried to drive a wedge between my bestie and I. She moved away after high school. My friend and I would bring her up occasionally and talk about some of her worst qualities and say how glad we were that we never had to see her again. One time, as we were doing so in a restaurant, suddenly she appeared right next to our table. She'd come back to visit someone and just happened to be right where we were right as we were discussing her. So awkward. It was 5 minutes of awkward and then she left and we just sat there like Daft Punk. I was about 3 or 4 and my grandpa took me for a walk. Suddenly, I had this very intense feeling of synchronicity. Without thinking, I raised my palm in front of me and in that instant bird poo landed right onto it. The strangest part was, I knew that this is going to happen. Can't really describe it, but it was strangely the most perfect moment of my life. BTW. Sorry for my English. Edit. Whoa. My first silver. Thank you. When I was in university, in Toronto, I was flying to England for a debating tournament. I booked my flight, then told my partner the date and time of the flight so he could book as well. The day before we left, we agreed to meet at a particular subway station and go to the end of the line to catch the bus to the airport. The next day I go to the subway station at the agreed time, but he doesn't show up. Pre-cell phone days, so I can't call him. Eventually I have to go, so I take the subway bus, get to the airport and go to the gate, but there's no sign of him. I have him page over the loudspeaker, no result. I tell this story to the gate agent who looks up the passenger list. He's not on it. Confused, I fly to London. I did find him the next day in London, which is another story all its own. Almost as coincidental. It turned out that while I was on one level of the subway station waiting to travel north to catch a bus to Terminal 1 at the airport for my flight, he was on the other level of the same station waiting to travel west to catch a bus to Terminal 2 for his flight, which was at exactly the same time on the same day, but on a different airline. Every step of the way, we had been describing identical routes, but without ever having any overlap.